We have with us now Mr. Unmesh Pawar. And Unmesh, the way I would describe him, apart from all that's written down here, is one of the most astute and articulate HR leaders. He's also very passionate about decoding the unconscious biases at workplaces. So we're going to get him to shed some light on those two with respect to our context. Hi, Unmesh. Welcome to our summit.
Hey, Vinny, thank you for having me, and a hi to everybody who is watching this live or online right now. It's a privilege to be associated with Winnie and being able to speak to you and present some of my thoughts with the group.
Lovely. So, Unmesh, I'll dive straight in. What, according to you, is the competitive advantage that each generation has that others can look as an advantage?
I think great question, and I think as you were going through your precursor to the session just now, I think one thing that stands out for me, Winnie, I think it's always been this, right? And my career of about 3 decades, I've always had experiences where leaders stood on the top of the chairs and said, well, the generation that's coming into the workforce is not as serious as we were, is not as hardworking as we were, are oriented very differently. I haven't seen that change. And I think that is here to stay. That's the first premise. The second premise is that the waves of generations that are coming into the workforce, potentially that used to happen every a decade and a half ago in the past. Now, every 7 to 8 years, you're starting to see a newer generation that's coming into the workforce. And that has its own advantages and has its own challenges. And I will come to that. I think the third thing I'd like to state is the way the Western world defines generational diversity by the silent generation, the Gen X, the baby boomers, the millennials, and the Gen Y. I think all of that is let's not forget, it's a factor of socioeconomic conditioning, right? The Western world has been privileged enough to have had abundance very early compared to where some of the developing nations have had, right? And therefore, what defines potentially the Western world is possibly the world wars, the Great Depression, and some of the Vietnam War, if you be. So all of that kind of defines what the Western world has gone through. And therefore, the children have been brought up in a particular environment, and that defines when they come into the workforce, how they operate. That's the mental conditioning that plays out. We in India, to some degree, lived through license Raj for most of our growing years. And then somewhere towards the 1990s, if I'm not mistaken, we started to experience the opening up of the economy, where opportunities started to become more abundant for us. And we started to experience a level of affluence in the country where with opportunities came better international jobs with more money. And that obviously meant that what we provide for the generation that's coming in is very different. So I think, so somewhere those years that I mentioned, I think they blur when it comes to in the Indian context. Now, having said that as the premise of what I will say going forward. So for me, it's not as hard-coded as it is. For me, when I look at the different waves that are coming in, for me, it's the persona of the workforce. And the persona of the workforce could have a level of plasticity depending on what background these individuals have come from, right? And now, what are the advantages? And we all know that pre-1990s, if you be, there was a level of scarcity mindset that we grew from. And therefore, the ability to take risks was limited. And therefore, loyalty was a factor. People entered from one side of the workforce and retired from the other. Some of our grandparents and parents practically did that, right? They went into one organization, they lived through it, good days, bad days, they stuck it out. And the owner of that organization or whatever did what he or she could to take care of that loyalty by virtue of providing them compensation, which was decent, on Diwali, providing bonuses or providing the sweet, or for recognizing that loyalty possibly through a gold coin at 25 years or all of that, or a watch at 35 years when you're retiring. So on that had a lot of emotional and sentimental value. And I've seen my grandfather when he retired, he had a watch and he was very, very passionate about that. And they held it like a medal to some degree, right? So there is a level of strength and capability that a generation brings in. Then the generations that are coming in now into the workforce, the millennials are what I call as the digital immigrants, and the Gen Zs are people who have actually born in an environment where the cell phones were all that were around, right? And therefore, the level of adoption of technology is relatively easy for the newer generations. They are far more savvier being able to navigate through some of that. And therefore, if you look at both of these, the erstwhile generations bring a level of problem solving capability, which was very different, a level of loyalty and resilience, which was very different compared to the generations today who are very adept at technology, whose educational system has been more broad-minded, their exposure has been beyond the national boundaries, their awareness about international issues to some degree is much better. And because they have been to some degree privileged to have experienced the basic needs because their parents had a level of affluence, higher order needs become more important to them. And therefore, the generations now are talking about the larger purpose, talking about being responsible for the planet. And this was not something that was very important for the generations before. For them, it was about getting in there. I took a responsibility. I will die on it and I will do a great job of it. I will leave a legacy so that my business leader or my owner feels the fact that, oh, they're good. And that recognition came from there, right? So I think those are two different things. And I think the strength is being able to marry these differences, if you be, and be able to drive synergies through the organization. And today you have organizations that have 5 generations in the workforce. So it is challenging, I'm sure, but it also adds a lot of meat and value to an organization, because think about a team that you're formulating to solve a problem or working on something that can bring this different thinking and cognitive capability to that. And if you know how to harness that well and drive synergy, and there is research to prove that organizations that have done a good job of getting diverse teams together are clearly high performing teams, right? But it takes effort. One has to be intentional. Stereotyping is very easy. Consciously being aware of the fact that working styles are very different. So I think I'll pause at that, Vinny, and we'll see where some of the other questions take us, and I can add more.
So like you said, that you are that it is about having that diversity even within a team. And so is that different from all the other diversities that we speak about, like, does a multi-generational composition of workforce qualify as a diverse team? Is it any different from gender diversity or an ability diversity?
I think it's a yes and no answer. I mean, it's an and answer rather than an or answer to me, right? I think what you need, for me, it's where we have got to today in the workforce is what I call as the audience of one.
Okay.
No longer can you, and it was very easy to be an HR leader or the erstwhile personnel leader, because then you could come up with standard processes and launch it and the hope that it will all work. Today, and because of what I said a few minutes back, that every individual has had experiences which are very different over the last 2.5, 3 decades. And that is a factor of where their family was when India started to open up, right? Where if they were far, far below the poverty line, and then they took a time to get there. But if somebody was middle class, upper middle class at the point when India started to open up, then what they experience is very different things. So today in the workforce, you have all of these mixes. And I think there's an interesting example that some of us would have seen some time back, right? I think, I don't know who I attributed to, but they said that when our grandparents were in the workforce, for them, roti, kapda, and makan was most important, right? And not just for themselves, but for the generation that is coming in. And that's just very Indian about us. And I'm sure it's changing in the generation right now that we want to preserve for the next generation. Then after the grandparent generation came some of our parents, where basic roti kapda was taken care of, right? They had to worry about makan and education for their children, and they provided potentially a good education for their children, which was relatively diverse. They did the best that they could from an education standpoint, and a lot of them were able to send their kids for international education outside the country. And now that generation that is coming into the workforce has possibly benefited because both their parents were working, and not being able to devote enough time to the children meant that you compensate for that in other ways. And more often than not, that came through compensating more than by virtue of time. The compensation happened through means, and providing things that were potentially well ahead of the needs. and so it is a lot that has never necessarily had to ask, right? They haven't experienced delaying gratification. And that has its own implications when you see how that plays out in the workforce, right? Now, whether it is to do with gender diversity, whether it is to do with LGBTQI agenda, and then if you look at this whole generational diversity element, I think what are we trying to do through all of this? What we're trying to establish through all of this in an organization is, if it happens in society, then it happens in my workforce, sorry, because my workforce is a reflection of what society is, right? And if that is true, then if for an individual to be authentic in their best, it's important for them to be authentic, for them to be at their best performance, right? Because if you're wearing a mask all the time, then the chances are, if your inner self and your outer self is not in sync, then the chances are you're not at your optimum best. And what you're trying to do is nothing but build a social system within an organization where everybody can be who they are in the process of that. Right? And what we at the workforce are trying to do as HR leaders within an organization are trying to understand what different minority groups, if you call them that, right? What are some of their needs, and what do we need to do to build an ecosystem that there is an appreciation, that there is distinction, that they are different, but then how do you come together? And when you're coming together as a team, you're being able to establish that. I think here are some examples that come to my mind, Vinny, right? So I think you talked about multi-generational teams. And I said that in my opening comments, saying there is research to prove that organizations that have done a good job of being able to synergize their multi-generations have seen better performance. And I think one way of doing that is when you're kicking off a project team, right? And you know that there are different generations of the workforce within that team, and you have consciously endeavored to build a team that is cognitively diverse by virtue of their constitution. Then what the expectation is, when you talk about as a leader, what the what of the project and the when of the project, saying what needs to be accomplished and by when we need to accomplish that, and let the team think it through to say how they will accomplish this. And then every individual talks about what they bring to the table in the process, right? To say, well, I have done work on XYZ clients before. I have relationships with them. I have a deeper understanding of the client ecosystem. I have seen 2 CEO changes in the past. I know the industry very well. So that's what a particular generation brings in, right? But a younger generation employee would say, well, I understand that, but I also, well, I respect you for what you bring, but because there is seeds of change are sowed somewhere in history, right? And but I also understand how the digital ecosystem is changing and challenging this business right now, right? And I get that, and I worked with XYZ clients where I have helped them do that. Now, can we take the context that you have to offer and the appreciation that I have of what digital or new age strategy looks like, and how do we partner together, right? And so there is an appreciation of some of those, and that creates the platform for driving synergy, right? Whether newer, younger leaders appreciate them for the relationships they have, the context they have, and whilst the older generations, if you call them that, are using the younger generation that's coming into the workforce to be able to make change and make client impact. So that's one example that comes to my mind. And I think the other one that we have done, and have most organizations would have tried, is leveraging what I call as reverse mentoring. Reverse mentoring is nothing but getting in your millennials or getting your Gen Z to have more agency in the organization. And you do that by identifying your high potentials in the organization and giving and accelerating them through rank and file, and putting them at the leadership table, either as a mentor to the group or a mentor one-on-one to their leaders. And there are things, and there are there's a frame of thinking that the generation has today, right? They are not willing to wait for what I call as what the earlier generations did was sacrificing and pushing out gratification. This generation is about, I did this, I need to experience it right now. I'm not going to wait for 6-9 months for this gratification, right? But there is very powerful thinking. Now, I mean, I was at some time back, I was at a public sector bank in India, and I was talking to their business and HR leaders. I said, do you not feel the pressure of the responsibility that you carry? Because the generation that I was talking to, most of them were potentially baby boomers, I'd like to believe. I said, you are creating digital platforms for banking that Gen Z and a Gen after that's coming after it are going to embrace. Most of us struggle to communicate effectively with our own teenagers at home, right? And we realize that it primarily comes because the way they look at things and the way we look at things is slightly different. But we feel that we are equipped to design technology that they're potentially going to use, right? So if I were to take that same example into this, then there's the value that you have of using this younger generation as mentors for leaders in the one-on-one or to the group, to test out some of that, to challenge some of the thinking, because that's value, right? Because, and they do not have the challenge that what you experience in erstwhile generations of deferring to authority, right?
Yeah.
They are very, very comfortable today saying, I hear you, but I defer, I disagree because of A, B, and C that I know, right? So I think that challenge, which is a healthy challenge, I think works very powerfully from an organizational context standpoint. So those are 2 or 3 ways that I feel and I've experienced that one can push for more synergy in an organization and be able to drive more benefits.
So, Mish, I love it. I think that whenever we speak of these older generations, of course, we speak of the fact that, they are embracing and getting familiar with digital now and adopting digital now, whereas the younger generations can contribute with that. So there's a tech part of it. And then there is this whole experience, the whole risk mitigation, the whole groundedness part of it. The thing I want to further break down, because I think these are very clear distinctions, right? Okay, this is a digital generation, and this is, this is a generation that literally had to adopt it, that had to open up their mind to it. But what I observe in workspaces now, and literally every time, we talk to clients, we talk to professionals, I think it's now starting to go beyond digital. So while, and this is an extremely, I'm not even saying it's only in some segments or some categories of professionals. So it's not necessarily, your very young junior professionals from average schools or high profile B schools. It's across the board. I think it's beyond digital. For some reason, the millennials, if we can broadly call them that, right? They feel that they are not heard enough by the Gen Xers or even baby boomers, because they feel whenever we put across a point, we get dismissed. Now, I also sometimes get a sense, and this is literally playing the devil's advocate, that do they or would they have also been open to a perspective that the Gen Xers and the baby boomers could be right because they have done the time, and it's not for that reason? How do they find a balance? Like, how does a millennial feel that when their ideas or their inputs are not taken up, it's not about a generational divide? It could well be something that happens across generations. It's not like every time a Gen X puts across something, it's taken up. So, and I know that you're very good at breaking things down in a granular way to, to specifically put across, how does one condition their minds then to believe that it's not all bad, and it's not that it's not all zero or one. What should the millennials do and what should the Gen Xers do?
Look, I think rightly said, it's not only about technology. I think, as I said, it's about the mental models and frames that get institutionalized because of the context that you have operated or lived through in life, right? Classic examples of work hours, right? Where the erstwhile generations would believe in long working hours, right? So working on weekends, working long hours, and and I call it MAFA, mistaking activity for achievement, right? But the generations of today said, well, you asked me to do something. I am on track to deliver it when I told you I'm going to deliver it. I do not see a reason why I need to be sitting long hours to do that, first. Second, I think, is the inability to stay within boundaries, right? Because what the Gen Zs have experienced is an education system which is more application based and not just structure based, right? It's not black and white. They're relatively comfortable with the gray thinking, and therefore, if their comms is not as articulate or as clear as is required, then you start to experience challenges today, because saying, so what are they really saying? And you will have a far more directional style of conversation that your boomers and X's would use, saying, I want you to do this, right? But at the same time, this generation has experienced the parents at home saying, ideally, think about it. If you were to do this, this would happen. So what do you want to do? Right now, that's very different to suddenly you come to work and you're experiencing a calm style, which is so directive. And their mindset saying, you're treating me, and exactly to your point, I suddenly feel that my agency is being taken away. You're not treating me like an adult. And the belief is that we all hire fully formed adults in our workforce, but we bring them into the workforce and we treat them exactly like how we treat kids. Right? So that's one example. The other one, which is something that most organizations today are grappling with, is the return to work, right? Where the leaders, some millennials and the baby boomers and some ex-leaders, believe that work happens only in the workplace, whilst pandemic has proved that people can be productive even if they're away. Now, there are different school of thought to say the level of productivity that we experienced was because people had nothing else to do, and there was a level of insecurity that everybody was experiencing through COVID, right? But having said that, there is just this inertia today in Gen Z to say, I will not come to work. I believe I can operate from anywhere. And right now, there's conversations that are happening where organizations are saying, if people are not coming in, should we experience with what we call as mobile offices, right? Where for 5 weeks, we come together and work from Goa, then we potentially go to the backwaters in Kerala, we go to Rishikesh. So the whole thing is, that's what people have been doing. That's what some of the younger generations have been doing through COVID. They feel a need to come together, but they want to do it on their terms, right? And so coming further, right? One, communication is different. Ours and how we look at ours is different. How we look at where work happens from is very different. Again, the whole point around workspaces, right? The generations now need workspaces that are far more collaboration friendly, more cafeteria kindish, what we experience the like of WeWorks, etc. But and therefore open offices, no cabins is something that they potentially may be would be very comfortable with, right? And we know that research proves that that may not be the only answer. The answer is in the end. You need closed spaces and you need great collaboration spaces, right? I think this whole drama about having only open spaces and no closed spaces, we've realized it impacts productivity. There are areas, there are times where you need that space. And therefore, but the older generations are far more comfortable having their offices, corner offices, frosted offices, and all of that. Those are symbols, right? So I think those are, and those are all things that you are grappling with in the workforce, right? How do you compensation for that matter, right? I mean, the how do you address compensation for Gen Z when for them, they're not willing to wait for deferred cash or deferred bonuses? Saying, I worked through it, I need to be paid for it now, right? And the erstwhile generations are far more comfortable with ESOPs, comfortable with restricted share units, or comfortable with deferred cash. And you could say, well, deferred cash of this, but paid over 3 years. But the generations of today are not willing to wait for those 3 years, right? So all of that, if you look at it, are challenges that we are working through, right? So we have to have what I call as responding to fit for purpose for each of the generations, right? Communication for that matter, right? Now you can't say that, oh, all comms is going to be online because you have 5 different generations in the workforce. And therefore, how do you respond to it? Some generations, the same message needs to be delivered to 2 or 3 different mediums, right? Some needs to be done face to face because there are generations that respond to that well. Some needs to be done through emailers because they are comfortable going through the nooks and corners and pointing out grammatical mistakes that may be, but reading through that. And some are very comfortable with sending a short reel kind of videos to say, hey guys, this is what it is, and boom. So communication also, there are distinctions, and therefore as HR or people leaders, if you be, you have to think through all of this and provide people a medium to have agency in the organization, to believe that they have an opportunity to shape their ecosystem. They have a voice in taking decisions. Their views are important, and closing a loop to say, well, great, thank you very much. These are great ideas. We love the fact that you want us to have alcohol at the offices and we should party on the Friday evening. But here are shops and establishment potential restrictions around it. Or if we were to do that, a license would cost us this much. And that's the hole we are burning into our business. So if you are a promoter founder of this business at this juncture in your life of this organization, do you believe you can digest a cost like that? So most times not explaining the consequence of a particular thing creates a situation where people don't understand the why of it and therefore take away. And that's what the friction comes in from. I think so. We need to equip our people leaders to be able to help people with the context around their decisions. And same way, we need to educate our younger generations with appreciating the decisions and helping them understand the why of it, as also explain to them why what they said could play out well and when that could play out well. So, well, rather long-winded answer, but I hope it kind of resonates with what you asked.
Yes, I think what you said, that we need to give them context, we need to explain. But I have a counter to that, because this is something I have been observing a lot. Unmesh, it may not be necessary every time for every stakeholder to explain a whole process behind something, because that's counterproductive. And what people are observing, like what the younger generation is observing, is that there is no thought put behind what the older generation wants, and we are giving great ideas and they are dismissing it because of ego. The older generation feels that we've thought this through, but we can't explain it on a granular level, one by one. This is what happened, this is how we've come to. I want you to tell me, if you were the older generation, how would you keep it productive without having to give way too much context, but enough to convince the other generation that they can trust your decision making? And if you were a younger generation, like a millennial, how can you first learn to accept, and at the same time put your point across if you really believe in, like you said, if you really want that agency and you want to be able to create that, you want to be able to be a part of the decision making.
So just about, I think a week ago, one of the startups that I mentor, the founder was asking me this because what they've experienced is a high churn rate. Now, the founders themselves, I think, potentially on the cusp of millennial or Gen Z themselves. So it's not that they are belonging to a newer generation, but they are facing this challenge with generation that's coming into the workforce. They just don't get it. I mean, like, and I think like, and this goes back to what I said, right? That it's not about really about the generations. It's about the outlook that people come with. And I think what comes to my mind at that, Vinny, is what I call as performance contracting, right? It's a tool that I use with people that work for me, irrespective of generation that they belong to, which is really about telling people the what and the when. So hypothetically, to say we have a leadership visit happening in a fortnight. We need to present the view of our function, right? We have a 1 hour window, and our slot is going to be on so and so date at so and so time, right? What I would like for us to accomplish when we finish that meeting is that when that leadership goes through our presentation or our view, what do you want them to think, feel, say, do? I want them to go away feeling that we have come a distance in the last 6 months since we last presented. There are structural interventions that we have brought into the function. We are much more stabler now. We have a game plan that is agreed with all our stakeholders, right? And I want them to walk away knowing that without the commitment of the budgets that we are asking for, this journey could start to see some headwinds. That's what I would like to accomplish. So I've talked about the what, the context behind the what, and I've told you the when. I would then say, Vinny, can you like try and break this down for me to say, how would you accomplish this? How would you put this together? And what I'm doing is, rather than telling Vinny, saying, Vinny, go to this person, go to that person, pick this data, pick that data, I'm testing out an opportunity for Vinny to think this through. So giving her the time to say, Vinny, so Vinny's going to say, well, if that is what needs to get accomplished, then here are the 4 pillars that come to my mind, right? So then I'll say, well, but what about this one? Oh, actually, yeah, there are 5 then. Okay, great. Now in this 5, this is how I will go about building it out. Here's XYZ person who will ask for information. This is what the wireframe could look like. And then I'll say, great, this all looks exciting to me. But of these 5 things that you're going to do, where is that you need me to come in explicitly? And what is that you're going to do independently? So she'll say, well, all of this is great, but the information from the finance organization is not going to come in easily because obvious reasons, considering it's confidential. So I would need your intervention here to talk to the CFO and help me get this information. Okay, if you can get this to me by so and so time, then I have a better chance of pulling this together. Okay, great. So I hear where I need to come in actively. Right? Then I'll say, great, if that's what the case, then when should we have the first checkpoint on this? Right? Say, well, let's do like 2 days before the meeting. Well, that I'm not comfortable with that because that's putting too much of risk. Why don't we, if you are okay, can we do it this way? Whilst you think through about where and how you're going to source data and you do that parallelly, can you put a wireframe of the deck together, presentation together, and socialize that with me in 3 days' time? So then once you and I agree on the wireframe, all you need to do is to put the information that or data that's required around it, and then polish the narrative. So you don't have to, I'm not sending you on a wild goose chase to collect tons of data and it's not going to fit into the narrative, right? Great. So 3 days later, you'll send me the thing. I'll give you feedback in a day or two on that. You and I can talk about it, and then you can go about building it. And yes, let's have the checkpoint 3 days before final presentation to look at how the material has come through. One last need for us to refine it, and then we are good to go. Most times, what leaders do is, oh, we have this leadership visit coming. Why don't you prepare this deck? Right? That deck comes to you 3 days before. And you realize that's not what you wanted because that poor individual, Vinny, has gone spending tons of time creating stress on the entire organizational ecosystem, who had to carve out data from different places, of which only 20% is going to be used finally in the narrative, right? And you have a problem of plenty. So therefore, there is a role as a leader you have to play of shepherding it and helping with the building of the overall narrative. And you have people will surprise you with what in cognitive and intellectual capability they have. But are you willing to let them have that? So you have to invest. So my big belief is, if you invest time upfront, Vinny, you save a lot of surprises in the journey, and you save a lot of time for yourself through the journey later. And most frustrations come because you have given only one bit of information. They have used their own lenses on what it means. And then you realize, well, this is not what I wanted. Well, you didn't set the right context.
Yeah.
So that's hopefully an example that jumps up to me of trying
Yes,
to bring it to life.
I think that's very nicely broken down, especially from Gen X or the older generation perspective. And actually, very good, because you're right. If we start that collaboration from the beginning, then people feel invested and you're heading in the right direction from the beginning, and you're course correcting along the way, not at the end of, towards the fag end. How does a Gen Y or a millennial still come to terms with the fact that sometimes their ideas may not be accepted? What if I was Gen Y? How do I how how do I understand that there are trade-offs, and there will be days when I'll have my hits and days when I'll have my misses. So what can I do to start accepting that reality?
I think the question is about radical candor in the organization. I think we don't do a great job of that in our organization, of providing people real-time feedback on what they're saying. And I think the what and why of it is important. Saying, very great idea, but I don't believe we can afford that at this juncture, right? So maybe in 2 quarters, when we are in a better state, we could review this, right? Or for this to happen, these 3 other preconditions are required, and I'm not sure you necessarily thought it through. Or I would ask you for saying, great idea, tell me what it will take for us to implement this. What are precursors to that to happen? And then you obviously yourself will say, oh, actually, for that to happen, the client ecosystem needs to be in a very different place, and maybe we are not there as yet right now. Well, you got your answer. Sometimes people come up with ideas. The first idea may not be the best idea, but when you push that idea, challenge it slightly, it forces them to rethink it. And when you think it through, then you yourself realize, may not be my best thinking. So that's where it is. I think the bigger element is it's not surprising to see leaders say, the kids on the team, let's get the kids in the room, right? And then you should not feel offended if they say the oldies are calling us, right? So I think you need to understand, when you're bringing people into the organization, they are all adults. And therefore, it's unfair to expect that the youngest team member on the team who has joined the team, because he's just an intern, or because he's just or she's just a trainee on the team, will be obviously taking minutes.
But I also want to ask you about the flip side. So that's what the older generations need to do. What can the younger generations do also to be collaborative and open-minded?
Ask more questions, and ask it in the right manner, not with some arrogance that the Gen Zs or the baby boomer leaders will feel offended with, or even the millennials will feel offended with. I think it's about the how to be. Look, you could say the same thing to your mom and dad, and they're okay with tolerating your nonsense sometimes. But people at work are not necessarily your moms and dads. So you need to be a bit more respectable in how you ask questions. And I think if that was to happen, saying, look, you just said this, would it be okay for you to just help peel that a bit for me, because I don't understand this, right? And I'm asking from a genuine place of curiosity, if you could just help break this down for me, right? Or maybe now is not a good time, but just over coffee, if you could just help me understand this better, because I've experienced this 3 times that I don't connect with the decision. Maybe it's right, but I don't connect with it. So help me with the thinking on this.
which can
It's
help
how
me align with your thoughts. Absolutely.
it's
Yeah.
about how you ask. I don't think any of us have a disconnect with explaining and putting the time. And we all have a responsibility of coaching, have a responsibility in the spirit of stewardship of building our people. But I think if there is arrogance that you experience somewhere in the back of the mind, saying, how dare you comes up, right? So I think that's something that we need to equip our younger generation to ask questions in the right manner and ask it at the right time and with the right intention. I think rather, see, the issue is we've all experienced that, Vinny, right? And we've done that in school too. Sometimes we've been very cocky and we asked our professors very questions because you thought you knew it all, right? And the professor gets it, saying, where's that coming from? And there are some professors who care two hoots about it and will say, just get out of the room and I've worked to get done with the other students. Or I'll say, well, why don't you and I catch up offline? We can talk about it. Or they'll professor, okay, great. Help me, help me understand where your questioning is coming from. Right. So I think that's where it is. So I think, look, I don't believe it's about generation. It's just about individuals' behaviors. And we've all behaved like that at point in time.
Right. So I think, yes, very nicely put. Okay, so then if I have to say, in this context, if what can you tell me about if I wanted to upskill myself and I was Gen X, Gen Y, and Gen Z, what kind of training or coaching do you think would help each generation at that stage?
The tough one, right? I think for the Gen Zs, Gen Ys that is coming in, I think investing more time in understanding context of an organization or the context of the business problems, I think is important, right? I think what happens is this whole thing of quick and easy, quick and easy. I think you have to invest, right? You need to know that much as you will believe, a career is a marathon. You will have good days, you'll have bad days, and the only way in today's times to stay relevant is to be able to go deeper in certain areas as you become a jack of all trades. But you need to have certain USPs, right? You need to have something special that you have on board. For generations that are before in the workforce, I think it's about understanding what disruptions, technological disruptions that will potentially upset your apple cart in your own business or the businesses that you're working for, and the role that technology can enable some of the work that you're doing. And I'm a believer that all businesses going forward will be tech businesses for most, and therefore having an appreciation for that. And I think a lot of companies are in denial, right? I work for an advertising and media company, and I, for one, genuinely believe that whilst there's the craft, but the craft also is changing with technology. And that's what our leaders are talking about. Just yesterday, our leader in Asia Pacific talked about metaverse and the impact of metaverse for the advertising, PR, media business. So that's something that they will have to look at. And I think for the older generations is about understanding people and understanding how people tick, i.e., positively, what works for people, and how to motivate generations, and how do you bring synergies across different segments of talent, I think is important. And I'm consciously not using the generational distinction here, but they're different people, and how do you strike a balance between different people and genuinely being authentic leaders? And some things are natural to people, but most of these things can be taught, according to me.
And what role do you think fears and insecurities play in this whole ecosystem? Is it that a certain generation would come with certain level of fears and insecurities with respect to the other generations, or is it got to do with their own future? Is it both? What is the role it plays?
It's a very basic human emotion, right? Fear and fear on one side and craving on the other side. I think it's a plane, right? I think you cannot run away from it, and all of our behaviors originate from that, right? You have anything which is difficult, anything that is uncomfortable, you fear, and anything that is pleasant, you're constantly craving for. So it's a basic human emotion, and therefore, irrespective of generations, that will play out. For the older generation, it is the insecurity of the disruption that the younger talent is coming up with. Their ability to do the same thing in one third the time potentially could mean that a lot of the older generations would be out of jobs because you don't need so many people to do it. The harbingers of technology that the younger generation is coming with would mean huge disruptions at the bottom of the food chain from a workforce standpoint. Is that great for some of the oldies who have not embraced technology enough? It's not a great story. And we experienced that when computers were coming in, right? There were some of our parents and grandparents who embraced computers to some degree, right? They went through computer training programs, blah, blah, but they embraced it to some degree. And others just struggled, and therefore they took voluntary retirement and exited the workforce. So something like that is very natural to happen. So there is a level of fear and insecurity that is happening. And then coming to your younger generations and some of the conversations that we've had till now is the fear that I'm not valued enough, the fear that I'm wasting my time, the insecurity that is my resume relevant? Am I going to be marketable? Will I have a market outside? Oh, I've spent 6 months doing this. This is boring work. I'm losing time in life. I have one life. You live but once, so you got to make the most of it. Okay, let's move to the next spot. Those are very real realities, and I think my submission for the younger generation is and what Reid Hoffman talks about, tours of duty, right? So once you sign up to a tour of duty, you stay invested in it, and you experience the highs, and you should experience the lows, because when you're on a high, you don't really introspect to say, why are all the things going so well for you, right? But it's in the moments of adversity, when you're rock bottom, when individual growth happens, right? Personality growth happens from the inside. And those are important moments, because that refines you as a lead, as a human being. It makes you a better person. It refines you as a leader, makes you a more reflective leader. So those are opportunities that one has to make use of. Every time there is a hardship, don't run away from it, because when there is pain, there is always going to be gain, according to me. But you don't have to stay in it forever, right? There are bound collarbones you define, and you get out of it at the right time, but you need to ensure that you're building the learnings from that opportunity.
I think so true. Yeah, it's more like pushing you out of the comfort zone to explore what's beyond than to, just struggle where you are. I think it's very beautiful. So Unmesh, I think great answers. I had so many questions listed down for you, but I think they've all just come out so beautifully through this conversation. We're going to now get into this whole quick one word or one line advice you'd like to give to each of the generations, right? So they may excel in a workforce, which, like you said, spans 5 generations now. So what is that one advice for Gen X that you'd like to give?
Remind me what Gen X is again. What years are we talking about now?
You and I. I tried to take the credit for saying, oh, what if I was a millennial? What if I was a Gen Z, to pass some confusion that I could be there, but no, this is what you and I are, Gen X.
I think it's about living in the moment.
Okay.
Rather than, I will do this when that happens. I think it's about saying, learn to live in the moment.
Okay, great. What about Gen Y, which is the generation after us? The digital migration generation.
I'd struggle with that one, honestly. I could jump straight into Gen Z for you, B, to say, well, I think similar to what I said a few minutes back, possibly is about the same comment to say life is a marathon, so stay with it, right? Don't look for the exit door all the time. I think that's my submission. So I think it's a contrast that I offered for the earlier generations and for the newer generations, to know that it's not always about the long term. Sometimes you have to be in the moment, because you end up sacrificing and not creating the moments that you need right now. And for the other generation, you need to pull back slightly to say it's not always about just in the moment and running away from it all the time. You got to stay with it. I think that's when both these parties come together somewhere, I think is where you will have a better, more functional society with lesser friction. So there is friction, which is not necessarily, which is not visible to the obvious, right? But there is that friction that's inherent in society. And with both parties take a little bit step towards moving to the other side, I think you have much more synergy and flow.
Fantastic. I think this has been lovely, a great conversation. Thank you so much once again for being a part of the summit.
Thank you very much. And well, I've had an opportunity to listen to some of the other speakers. Great ideas, great thoughts, and you're doing a great job. So thank you very much for having me on. Have a great day ahead.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Cheers. Bye.